Josephine Carver brought the Duke of Strathearn £40,000 of her father's shipping money, and on her wedding day, not one guest in the cathedral let her forget that the money was the only thing she had brought. It was the second week of December, in a year when the frost came early and stayed, and the great cathedral in town was cold enough that the breath of 300 peers hung in the air like smoke. Josephine stood at the head of the long aisle in a gown of dove-grey silk that had cost more than most of the men present earned in a season, and she felt every eye in the building settle on her and weigh her and find her wanting. She had expected this. She had braced for it the way a sailor braces for weather he can see coming across open water. All the long week of fittings and contracts and her father's anxious hovering. She had told herself it would not touch her, and now that she stood inside it, she found that knowing a thing is coming does very little to soften it when it arrives. The cold of the stone came up through the thin soles of her wedding slippers. The eyes came at her from both sides at once. Behind her, two ladies she had never been introduced to spoke to one another in voices pitched precisely loud enough to carry. £40,000, said the first. For a coronet. I'd heard it was 30. 30 would not have been enough, said the second. Not for Strathearn. He had to be paid handsomely to stoop so low. Josephine kept her chin level and her gaze forward. She had been taught a great many things by her father, and one of them was that a person who shows the wound only invites a second blow. So she let the words slide off her like rain off oilcloth, and she walked, and she did not let them see that they had landed at all. But they had landed. She would not have been honest with herself if she pretended otherwise. There was an old, worn place inside her, where words like those always landed, a place rubbed raw long before this morning. All her life she had been precisely this, good enough to fund a thing, never good enough to belong to it, good enough to keep her father's books, never to be presented at the assemblies the wives of his customers attended, good enough to be married up the moment her dowry could buy a title, as though the whole of her 24 years had been a sum being saved towards someone else's rescue. She had learned not to weep over it. She had not learned not to feel it. She walked up the aisle toward the coldest, proudest man in England, and she married him. His name was Cassian Reeve, the 7th Duke of Strathearn, and he was 35 years old, and he stood at the altar like a man carved from the same grey stone as the pillars around him. He was tall and severe and unsmiling. His dark coat was perfectly cut, and worn, she noticed, very slightly worn at one cuff, though no one but a tradesman's daughter would ever have looked closely enough to see it. His face might have been handsome if there had been any warmth in it at all. There was none. He watched her come up the long aisle without any change in his face at all, the way a man watches something arrive that he has already made up his mind about. He did not look at her like a bridegroom. He looked at her like a creditor. The vicar spoke the words. Cassian answered them in a voice as level and dry as the turning of a ledger page. When it came her turn, Josephine answered them too, clearly, so that the watching Rose could not say afterward that the trade girl had mumbled her vows. She would give them no satisfaction, not one grain of it. And so it was done. They were married. The organ swelled, and the cold congregation rose, and Josephine Carver became the Duchess of Strathearn, and she understood with perfect clarity that not a soul in that vast building believed she belonged to the name now stitched to hers. She did not yet understand the half of it. The wedding breakfast was held in a hired set of rooms hung with rented splendour, and it was an exercise in quiet cruelty conducted with exquisite manners. Lords she would never see again bowed over her hand and called her Your Grace, in a tone that made the title sound like a joke. Ladies admired her gown and then asked with wide and innocent eyes whether the silk had come in on one of her father's own ships, as though the fact of trade were a stain she might have hoped to hide and had foolishly worn instead. She answered all of them pleasantly. She had a great deal of practice. Her father stood near the windows. Josiah Carver was a broad, ruddy, plain-spoken man who had built a fleet from a single leased boat, and he wore a coat that was very fine, and very plainly the coat of a man who had bought his way to fineness rather than been born to it. He watched her across the room, and she watched him back, and she felt the first thin thread of unease pull tight in her chest, because she could always read her father. Always. He was the one person in the world whose face was a book she had been reading, since before she could read anything else. And tonight there was something behind his eyes that she could not read, something he was holding back from her, and her father had never in her life held anything back from her. She crossed to him through the laughing crowd. "Papa," she said quietly, "you look as though you're at a funeral and not a wedding." He laughed too quickly. "A man's allowed to be sentimental, losing his only girl. You are not sentimental. You have never been sentimental in your life. You wept at my mother's grave, and then went directly back to the warehouse, because there was a cargo spoiling, and you were right to." She took his hand. It was cold. "What is it? Tell me." For a moment, just a moment, she thought he would. His mouth opened. Something moved across his ruddy face that was almost fear, and then a footman announced that the Duke's carriage stood ready, and the moment closed like a door, and her father pressed her hand and said only, "Be happy, Joe. That's all I ever wanted. Be happy, and be safe. You'll be safe now." She would think about those words a great many times in the weeks that followed. She would think about how he had said safe twice, and happy only once, as though safety were the thing he was truly trying to convince himself of. The Duke spoke to her exactly twice more during the breakfast, once to inform her that the carriage would depart at 4, and once, without quite looking at her, to tell her that they would travel directly to Strathearn Court, where the family kept its Christmas, and that a number of guests were already gathering there. "Guests," Josephine repeated. "A house party," he said. "It is a tradition of long standing. It would cause comment if it did not proceed. You will, I trust, be equal to it." It was not a question. There was no kindness in it. There was only the flat assumption that she would do what was required, because she had been bought to do what was required, and a purchase does not have feelings that need consulting. She looked at him for a moment. "I am equal to a great deal more than you imagine, Your Grace," she said. For the first time he looked at her directly. Really looked. And something flickered across his face. Not warmth, nothing so generous as that, but a flicker of attention, as though the column of figures had unexpectedly produced a sum he had not predicted. Then it was gone. He turned away, and the carriage left at 4 exactly. They rode in silence for the first hour. The town gave way to frozen fields, and the frozen fields to dark woods, and the short December day bled away to nothing until there was only the small lamp inside the carriage, and the cold glass, and the muffled drum of the horses on the hard road. Josephine watched the dark go by. Her husband sat across the narrow space from her, and after a while he took out a small notebook and began making entries in it by lamplight, his pen moving in short, precise strokes. And he did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. She let the silence run for a long time. Then she grew tired of it, because she had never in her life been comfortable letting a thing simply sit when it might be turned to use. "You make a great many notes, Your Grace," she said. He did not look up. "I find it steadies the mind. My father is the same, though his notes are mostly the prices of things. Tallow and timber, and what the Dutch are charging for it this month, and what he thinks they will be charging by spring." She watched him. "What do you note?" For a moment she thought he would not answer at all. Then he said, still without looking up, "The same, the prices of things. And what are you pricing at present?" The pen stopped. He looked up then, and in the swaying lamplight his grey eyes were unreadable. "You," he said, "if you must know. I am attempting to determine what manner of woman I have married, and I confess the figures will not settle." "That is because you are using the wrong ledger," said Josephine. "You are pricing me as a purchase, a thing bought, but a purchase only tells you what a thing cost. It tells you nothing of what it is worth, and the two are very seldom the same number. My father taught me that before I could walk. The cheapest cargo in the hold is sometimes the one that saves the voyage." He did not answer that, but he closed the notebook, and he did not open it again for the rest of the journey, and that, she would learn, was as close as the Duke of Strathearn came in those early days to conceding a point. Strathearn Court rose out of the snow near midnight, and it was the most magnificent thing Josephine had ever seen. It was a vast, pale house of many windows, and lights burned in a dozen of them, and torches lined the long drive, and against the black sky and the white snow, it looked like something out of an old painting of how the great once lived. Her heart, traitor that it was, lifted at the sight of it. "This is mine now," she thought. "Whatever else is true, this much is mine." The thought did not survive the front hall. The hall was grand, and it was cold, and as she stepped into it, Josephine's quick eye, the eye her father had trained on warehouses and ledgers, and the true value of things behind their show, caught the first wrong note. There were pale rectangles on the walls, squares and oblongs, where the paper was a brighter, unfaded colour than the paper around it. Squares exactly the size and shape of paintings that were no longer there. She counted 4 of them before she made herself stop counting. A footman took her cloak. An ancient butler, white-haired and stooped and dignified as a bishop, bowed to her and introduced himself as Hobbs, and welcomed her to Strathearn Court in a voice that trembled only slightly. She liked him at once, though she could not have said why. Perhaps it was that he looked at her, when he straightened, as though he saw her, and not the £40,000. The Duke did not linger in the hall. "You will be shown to your rooms," he said. "The guests are abed. You will meet them tomorrow. I will come to you tonight." The words landed like a stone in cold water. Josephine felt the heat climb her neck, and felt too the eyes of Hobbs go carefully, deliberately blank, the way a good servant makes himself absent from a thing he is too well bred to have heard. "Will you?" she said. "I will," said the Duke. "There are things you must be told. Tonight and in private. Wait for me." And he turned and was gone down a long, dark corridor, and a maid with a candle came to lead the new Duchess of Strathearn up to the bridal chamber on her wedding night, to wait. The chamber was beautiful, and it was faintly shabby in the same way the hall had been. The hangings on the great bed were silk, worn thin along their folded edges. The fire was small for so large a grate. A branch of candles burned on the mantel, and by their light Josephine saw that here too there were the pale ghosts of vanished pictures on the walls. She dismissed the maid. She did not undress. She sat down in a chair by the inadequate fire, still in her grey silk, and she waited, and she thought. A great house should not have squares on its walls where the paintings used to be. A duke with £40,000 newly in his coffers should not keep so small a fire in his bride's room. A man who had been paid handsomely, as the cruel ladies in the cathedral had said, should not look at his own wedding like a creditor counting what he is owed. The pieces would not lie flat. She turned them over and over while the fire burned down, and the suspicion that grew in her was not the suspicion of a frightened bride waiting to be visited by a stranger. It was the suspicion of a merchant's daughter who had grown up smelling a failing concern, the way other people smell rain on the wind, hours before the first drop falls. When the Duke came, an hour past midnight, she was ready for him. He came without knocking, which she would remember afterward, because it was the only discourtesy she ever knew him to commit that was not deliberate, and she came in time to understand that it was not discourtesy at all, but the act of a man who had not the strength left to perform one more piece of ceremony that night. He had removed his coat. He looked in his shirt-sleeves by the candlelight, younger than he had at the altar, and far more tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes that the cathedral had hidden. He shut the door. He stood with his back to it for a moment, looking at her sitting fully dressed by the cold hearth, and something in his face shifted. "You have guessed something," he said. It was not a question. "I have guessed several things," said Josephine. "I am waiting to learn which of them is true." He crossed the room and stood by the mantel, one hand braced against the cold marble, looking down into the dying fire as though the words he had come to say were written somewhere in the embers. "You believe," he said, "that you have married a fortune. The whole of London believes it. Your father believes it. He believes he has bought his daughter a place at the high table, and that in exchange I have taken his money to gild a house already overflowing." He laughed once, a short and mirthless sound. "It is a very pretty story. There is not one word of truth in it." "Then tell me the true one," said Josephine. He turned and looked at her, and when he spoke, each word came out flat and hard and final, like a coin laid down on a table that could not be picked up again. "You did not marry a fortune," he said. "You married the last man in England with the nerve to pretend he still has one. The Strathearn coffers are dry, madam. They have been dry for years. Your dowry is all that stands between this house and the bailiffs at the gate." The fire popped. Somewhere far off in the great cold house a clock struck the half-hour, and the sound seemed to go on a long time. Josephine sat very still. She neither gasped nor wept, only let the truth arrange itself inside her, and found, to her own faint surprise, that the shock of it was smaller than it ought to have been. Part of her had already known. The squares on the walls had told her, and the thin silk and the small fire, and her father's twice-spoken safe, perhaps, most of all, though she could not yet have said why. She let the silence stretch until she was certain her voice would come out level. How dry, she said. He blinked. Of all the things he had braced for her to say, she could see it plainly. This had not been among them. He had walked into this room expecting tears or fury, or the swooning collapse of a girl who has just learned she has been swindled out of everything. He had not expected a question that a banker might ask. "What do you mean, how dry?" he said. "I mean precisely what I say." She rose from the chair, smoothing the grey silk, and she was glad of the small, steadying ritual of it. A man does not say his coffers are dry and mean nothing by it. There are degrees of the thing. Either there is debt standing against the estate, or there is not. Either the income covers the interest upon that debt, or it does not. Either there is a date on which the worst of it falls due, or there is time yet. How dry, your grace. Give me the figures, or do not waste my night with poetry. He stared at her, and for the second time that day that flicker crossed his face, that look of a sum coming out wrong, or perhaps coming out right in a way he had not allowed himself to hope. "There is debt," he said slowly. "A very great deal of debt. The estate income has not covered the interest upon it in 3 years. I have been selling, quietly, a painting here, a farm there, the hunting lodge in the north last spring, to keep the appearance of solvency and to go on meeting the payments as they fall." His jaw tightened. "Your dowry was to clear the largest of the notes, the one held against the whole of Strathearn, the one that, if it is called and cannot be met, takes the house, the land, the title seat, the whole of it, all at once." "And it can be called," said Josephine, "or you would not look as you do. It comes due," he said, "on the 5th of January, 12th night, in something under 4 weeks. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was almost, but not quite, an apology. "I married you, madam, to buy 4 weeks. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I knew exactly what I was doing. I am proud, and I am cold, and I married you under false colours, hiding that I am ruined, because your money was the last plank left between me and the gate. If you wish to despise me for it, you are entitled. A great many people would, and they would be right." Josephine crossed to the mantel and stood beside him. She looked into the fire as he had done, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and the strange thing was that the silence between them now was a different silence than the one in the carriage. That one had been a wall. This one was almost a held breath. She thought of the cathedral, the cold rows of faces, the murmured cruelties, the certainty of every soul present that she had bought a duke and the duke had been bought. She thought of how it would feel to watch this house go down, and her name with it, after all of that humiliation, with the whole of London nodding and saying they had known the match was rotten from the start. She thought of her father, grey-faced by the windows, hiding something behind his eyes. And then she thought, the way she always thought when the bottom dropped out of a thing, not about the falling, but about the climb back up. It was the only way she had ever known how to think. Her father had built a fleet out of that single habit of mind, and he had given it to her whole, the one inheritance no creditor could ever seize. "You have made one mistake," she said. "I have made a great many. In your reckoning of me." She turned to face him. "You married a merchant's daughter, as though that were the price you were paying, as though the trade of me were the shameful part of the bargain. You have it exactly backward, your grace. By the purest accident, you have married the one woman in England who knows precisely how to keep a sinking concern afloat. I was raised in trade. I have watched my father pull 3 failing ventures back from the very edge of the cliff with my own eyes, and the last of them I helped him do myself, with my own hands and my own figures. I know debt, I know credit, I know how to make a thing look solvent long enough that it becomes solvent in truth." She watched the words land on him. She watched the cold, proud face try and fail to make sense of them. "Then we are 2 liars sharing one name," she said. "Very well, your grace. I was raised in trade. I know how to keep a sinking concern looking solvent. Show me your world, and I will buy us the time to save it." He looked at her for a very long time. "Why?" he said at last, and the word came out rough, as though it had cost him something to push it past the pride. "I have given you no reason. I have lied to you and to your father. I have spent your dowry before you ever set eyes on this house. By every measure that exists, you should want nothing in the world so much as to see me ruined, and be quit of me." "Because the house going down takes me down with it," said Josephine simply. "I am the Duchess of Strathearn now, whether either of us likes it. If it sinks, I drown. That is reason enough for any sensible woman." She paused. "And because I have never once in my life walked away from a thing I might have saved. It is a failing in me. My father says it will be the death of me one day. You may keep your reasons, Your Grace, and I will keep mine, and it will not matter in the least, because they pull in precisely the same direction, which is the only thing that ever matters in a partnership." He inclined his head slowly, and it was the first thing he had ever done in her presence that resembled respect. "Then we have a pact," he said. "We have a pact," said Josephine. He left her not long after, to her own room and her own thoughts, and there was no wedding night in the way the world imagined it. There was only the truth, spoken plainly, and a bargain struck between two people who had each believed they were using the other and had each turned out to be right. It was, Josephine thought, as she finally lay down in the great cold bed and listened to the wind work at the old windows, a thoroughly unromantic beginning. She did not yet know how thoroughly it would change. What she did not see, because she could not, was the Duke standing alone in his own cold room an hour later, his single candle burned almost to the socket, staring at nothing. He had married her to buy time. That was all. He had chosen her, out of the 3 or 4 eligible fortunes his man of business had laid before him that autumn. For the plainest of reasons, the sum was the largest, the family the least likely to make trouble, the girl reputed sensible enough not to make scenes. He had braced himself to spend the next 40 years in the polite company of a woman he would never love, in exchange for not dying a pauper, and he had told himself it was a fair exchange because he had long ago priced love at nothing and a name at everything, and the arithmetic had always come out clean. And then the girl had asked him how dry. He could not stop thinking about it. 2 words, not how could you, not how dare you, not the tears he had armoured himself against the whole long ride from town. How dry! The question of a person already reaching past the disaster toward the repair of it. The question of a partner. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who lied to him kindly, who told him what he wished to hear, who managed him. And a tradesman's daughter he had bought for £40,000 had walked into the worst night of his life and told him the truth and then offered calmly to fight beside him. He did not know what to do with it. It did not fit any ledger he possessed. He blew out the candle. He did not sleep for a long time. The morning brought the house party, and the house party brought the wolves. They were a particular kind of guest, the people who had gathered at Strathearn that December. They were grand, and they were idle, and they had come for the shooting and the cards and the great Christmas feast, and most of all they had come to look at the Duke who had married money, and at the money he had married. Josephine felt their attention the moment she came down to breakfast, the same weighing she had felt in the cathedral, conducted now over chocolate and cold meats by people who smiled while they did it. She had dressed carefully. Not richly. Richly would have been a confession, an attempt to prove herself, and she would prove herself to no one in this house. She had dressed simply and well, the way her father dressed when he meant to be underestimated, and she came down composed, and she let them look. The worst of them was a woman named Lady Vesper Holt. Lady Vesper was perhaps 30, and she was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, all bright edges and cold gleam. She had been, Josephine gathered within the first hour, a fixture of the Strathearn set for years, and she ruled the gathering's gossip the way a general rules an army, deploying it where it would do the most harm. She greeted Josephine with enormous warmth, took both her hands, called her dear Duchess, and then, in the same breath and the same warm voice, asked whether she found the customs of polite society very confusing after the simpler ways of trade. "Not very," said Josephine. "The arithmetic is much the same, only the manners are dearer, and the goods are a good deal worse." A young woman near the window laughed before she could stop herself, and then went scarlet, and pressed her hand to her mouth. Lady Vesper's smile did not waver, but her pale eyes changed, hardened, fixed, and Josephine understood that in the space of one sentence she had made a real enemy. She found she did not greatly mind. She had been making enemies of that particular kind her whole life, and not one of them had yet stopped her from doing a single thing she had set her mind to. The young woman by the window turned out to be Lady Adela Reeve, the Duke's sister. She was 17, and she was as unlike her brother as a lark is unlike a hawk. She had his colouring and none of his cold. Her face hid nothing, gave away everything, lit and fell with every passing feeling like water under a changing sky. She was to make her debut in the spring, and she spoke of it with a shining, fragile excitement that caught at Josephine's heart and held it, because Josephine alone in all that laughing company knew that there was very likely no money for any debut at all. The gowns, the season, the whole bright future the girl was counting upon hung over the same black cliff edge as the house itself. Adela attached herself to Josephine almost at once. It was the open, undefended affection of a girl who had grown up in a cold house and was half-starved for warmth, and it disarmed Josephine completely, because Josephine had no defences ready for affection. She had only ever had to defend against contempt. By the end of that first day she had resolved two things, privately and without fuss. The first was that she would save Strathearn. The second was that whatever else happened in the world, this child would have her spring. "You are not at all what they said you would be," Adela confided that evening. Sitting too close on a sofa, her voice dropped to a whisper. "They said you would be vulgar. Lady Vesper said you would be vulgar. And you are not. You are the cleverest person in this whole dull house, and you said that thing about the goods being worse, and I thought I should die." She glanced at the door and dropped her voice further still. "My brother frightens everyone, you know. He frightens me a little, but he does not frighten you at all. I have been watching. Why does he not frighten you?" Josephine considered the question seriously, because the girl had asked it seriously. "Because frightening people," she said, "is generally something a person does when they are frightened themselves. And a person who is frightened is a person who needs help, whether they will say so or not. I find it difficult to be afraid of someone I can see needs help." She smoothed the girl's hair back from her face. "Your brother needs a great deal of help, Adela, more than he will ever tell you. So do not be too hard on him for being cold. The coldest grates are only the ones that have been let go out." She did not know when she said it how true it was. She was only being kind to a frightened girl, but she would remember the words later and find she had meant them more than she knew. The work began the next day, and it began the way her father had taught her, which was not with grand gestures but with the books. She went to the Duke and told him she would see the accounts. All of them. He hesitated. Pride, she saw, more than secrecy, the deep instinctive reluctance of a man to let another soul see the true and shameful measure of his ruin laid bare. And then he led her himself to a small locked room at the cold north end of the house, a counting room with a single high window and a smell of dust and old ink, and he unlocked it, and he laid the ledgers before her. There were two sets. She did not understand that at first. There were the great bound estate books, beautifully kept, every column ruled and totalled in a fine clerkly hand, and they told the story of a dukedom that was strained but fundamentally sound, an estate living a little beyond its means but not fatally so, the way half the great houses in England lived. And then, in a separate locked drawer, there was a second set, thinner, harsher, kept in the Duke's own less elegant hand, and these told the truth, and the truth was a catastrophe. "The fine ones are the ones my man of business keeps," the Duke said, watching her face very closely. "They are what is shown, to the bankers, to the world, to me, for the most part. The other set is what I have reconstructed myself these last 2 years, line by line at night, as I began to understand that the reality was a great deal worse than anything the record admitted." Josephine sat down at the cold table. She drew the candle close, and she bent over the two sets of books, and she did not come out of that room for 6 hours. The Duke, after a while, stopped watching her, and simply sat in the corner, with a book he did not read, and she was distantly aware of him there, a still grey presence at the edge of the candlelight, but most of her was in the figures. She read the way she had been taught to read, which was not for what was written, but for what was missing. She traced incomes in and outflows out. She followed the great mortgage against the seat, and the smaller notes scattered behind it like jackals behind a lion. She found the sales, the paintings, the townhouse, the home farm gone last Lady Day, and she found where the money from the sales had gone, and her brow furrowed slowly, and stayed furrowed, because it had not all gone where it should have. She did not say so. Not yet. A thing only half seen, said aloud too soon, has a way of slipping back into the shadows and being lost. So she made small marks in a notebook of her own, in a private shorthand her father had invented, and only the two of them could read, and she said nothing, and she went on reading until the high window had gone black, and Hobbs crept in to light fresh candles. But something was forming in her mind that had no shape yet, and had, instead, a smell. and the smell was the smell of a thing gone rotten from the inside out, the particular sick, sweet smell of a cargo that has spoiled in the hold while the captain swore all was well. "Your Grace," she said at last, setting down her pen, "who keeps the fine books? You said your man of business. What is his name?" "Quint," said the Duke. "Ambrose Quint. He has managed the affairs of this family for 30 years. He managed them for my father before me, and his own father managed them for my grandfather before that." He said it with the unthinking ease of a man describing the foundations of his own house, a thing so solid and so long-standing that it has never once occurred to him to wonder whether it might give way. He has been a rock through all of it. Without his management, I am quite certain we should have gone under years before now. Josephine said nothing. She looked down at the fine, false books, kept in their fine, clerkly hand, and at the harsh, true books beside them, and at the dark gap that yawned between the two of them, where a fortune had quietly, patiently disappeared, and she thought, a rock, or the hand that drilled the hole and let the water in a cupful at a time, so slowly that no one ever heard it come. But she had no proof. She had a smell, and a furrowed brow, and 30 years of unquestioning trust standing against her like a stone wall. So she said only, "I should like to meet him." "He is here," said the Duke, surprised. "At the house party. He keeps Christmas with us every year, has done since I was a boy. You will meet him at dinner." Ambrose Quint, when she met him at dinner that night, was the most reassuring man she had ever encountered, and that was the first thing about him that frightened her. He was perhaps 60, neat and spare and silver-haired, with a soft, pleasant voice and a way of listening that made whoever he spoke to feel they were the only person in the room. He wore plain, good clothes, well-kept and unremarkable. He had kind, tired eyes with deep creases at the corners, the eyes of a man who has spent his life in service to others and counts it a privilege. He spoke of the late Duke with real affection, and of the present one with a sort of careful paternal pride, and he welcomed Josephine to the family with a warmth that seemed entirely without calculation, and he asked after her father's business with what appeared to be genuine and knowledgeable interest. Everyone trusted Ambrose Quint. She could see that they did, all around the long table. The Duke trusted him completely. Young Adela called him a dear old thing and let him pat her hand. Even the servants, she would learn, spoke of him with respect and a kind of affection. He had spent 30 years being the most trustworthy man in any room he entered, and it had worked, because trustworthiness is the most valuable disguise a thief can wear, and Quint wore it the way another man wears a coat he has owned so long that he has forgotten it was ever anything but his own skin. When he asked her gently over the soup how she was finding the management of so great a house after the simpler scale of a merchant's home, she heard the question that lived underneath the question. He was asking how much she had seen, how deep she had looked. "It is a great deal larger," she said pleasantly, breaking her bread, "but a house is only a set of accounts with chimneys attached. I find I understand it rather better than I had expected to." She watched his kind, tired eyes as she said it, and for just a moment, so brief that she might almost have persuaded herself she had imagined it, something moved behind them that was not kind at all. A flat, cold, assessing flicker, there and gone, the look of a man recalculating. Then it was gone, and he smiled, and said how very fortunate the Duke was to have found a wife of such excellent sense, and turned the conversation to the weather and the prospects for hard ice on the lake before the week was out. But Josephine had seen it, and Ambrose Quint had seen that she had seen it, and so the two of them sat at the long table among the laughing wolves, smiling pleasantly at one another down the length of the white cloth and the silver, each of them now perfectly and privately aware that the other was the enemy, and neither saying one word of it aloud. The days that followed settled into a strange double rhythm, and it was in those days, in the cracks between the work, that the ice between Josephine and her husband began at last, without either of them quite noticing the moment it started, to thaw. By day she was the Duchess of Strathearn, gracious, untroubled, presiding over a house full of people who despised her, and she was very good at it, better than they had any of them expected, which made them despise her the more. By the stolen hours of the evening, and late into the night, she was something else entirely. She was the merchant's daughter in the cold counting-room. The candle burned down between them, and the Duke came to her there, and the two of them bent together over the ruin of his house, and the work knit them slowly into something that neither of them yet had a name for. It surprised her how quickly she came to value those hours. She had braced herself for a husband who would use her by day and ignore her by night, and instead she had found a man who, once he had decided to trust her with the truth, trusted her with the whole of it, completely, without the careful condescension she had spent her life learning to endure. He did not explain things to her twice. He did not soften his figures to spare her. He laid the worst of it in front of her, and waited to hear what she made of it, and there was, in that, a kind of respect she had never once been given by a man not her father. He did not soften toward her in some sudden romantic flowering. That was not his nature, and Josephine, who distrusted sudden softenings on deep principle, would not have believed it for an instant if he had. He thawed the way real ice thaws, which is to say slowly, and from underneath, and without any visible change to the hard, bright surface until very late in the season, when all at once it gives. It began with the work, because the work was the only language he trusted. He came to respect her mind first, because her mind was the thing he could measure. He watched her find, in 3 evenings, patterns in the accounts that he had stared at for 2 years without ever seeing, and she watched the watching change. The 3rd night, he stopped explaining the entries to her. The 4th night, he began to ask her what she made of them. The 5th, he set a question before her, and then sat back and waited, genuinely waited, for her answer, the way one colleague waits for another, and Josephine felt the small, private warmth of it, out of all proportion to the thing itself. There was a night, late, when she set down her pen and pressed the heels of her hands against her tired eyes and said, into the quiet, "You priced this marriage at £40,000. You told me so the first night, in those words near enough. Tell me, Your Grace, do you price everything in the world that way?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire ticked. Outside the high window, the snow came down without a sound. "Yes," he said at last. "I suppose I do. I'd never thought to put it so plainly, but yes." He turned his glass slowly in his fingers. "My father left me a name and a ruin in the very same breath. He died believing himself a rich man, you understand. He never knew. He had been told all his life that the foundations were sound, and he went to his grave believing it, and he left it all to me with a fond word about carrying on the family's consequence, and within the year I had learned the truth of what consequence costs. I was 24. Your age, near enough." He looked at her across the candle. "I learned very young that the world runs on worth and ledger, and that a man who lets himself forget it, who lets himself feel his way through life instead of counting it, loses everything and brings everyone who depends upon him down with him. So I learned to ask of every person and every choice what it was worth. It is not a quality that makes a man easy to love. I am aware of that. I gave up expecting to be loved a long time ago. I decided it was a luxury I could not afford, and I priced it accordingly, at nothing, and I have lived by that price ever since, and it has kept me upright when nothing else would." "That is a very sad arithmetic," said Josephine softly. "It is accurate arithmetic," he said, "which I have generally found to matter a great deal more than whether it is sad." She did not argue with him. She had already learned that he did not yield to argument. He yielded, when he yielded at all, only to demonstration. So she said nothing more about it. She picked up her pen again, and she bent back over the books, and she went on quietly, night after night, proving to him by the work itself that there was at least one thing in his whole ruined house that was worth a very great deal, and that he had got for nothing, and she let him do that arithmetic himself in his own time without being told. A small thing happened, perhaps a week into the work, that she kept and turned over many times afterward. She had been in the counting room very late, alone, the Duke having gone up hours before. The fire had died to nothing, and she had not noticed, lost in the columns, until the cold had crept so far into her fingers that the pen began to slip, and the door had opened, and it had been the Duke in his dressing gown, carrying a branch of fresh candles in one hand, and, in the other, awkwardly, a cup of something that steamed. "You will make yourself ill," he said, almost angrily, setting the cup down at her elbow. "Hobbs said your candle was still burning. It is past 2. The figures will keep until morning. They have kept 3 years. They can keep 1 night more." It was tea. He had brought her tea with his own hands in the middle of the night, because an old butler had told him her candle was burning, and he had not been able to leave it alone. He left at once, gruffly, before she could thank him, almost as though he were ashamed of it. Josephine sat in the cold room with the warm cup between her 2 hands, and found, to her great annoyance, that her eyes had filled. It was nothing. It was a cup of tea. She had been brought 1,000 cups of tea in her life, but no one had ever brought her one because they could not bear the thought of her sitting cold and alone in the dark, and she discovered that this, of all the things she had armoured herself against, was the one she had no armour for at all. She drank the tea. She did not tell him she had wept, but something in the wall she had built against him came down that night, quietly, in the dark, and it did not go back up. The household came over to her wholesale in those weeks, and that was Hobbs's doing as much as her own. The ancient butler had watched Strathearn hollowed out for years. He had carried out the great paintings to the dealers' carts with his own trembling hands. He had kept the secret of the small fires and the sold silver, and the footmen let quietly go one by one, and he had borne it as servants of the old school bore such things, in silence and shame, and it had aged him a decade in 3 years. And in the new Duchess he saw, with the unerring instinct of a man who had spent 60 years reading his betters better than they ever read themselves, the one thing that the rest of the Grand Laughing Company had entirely missed. He saw someone who meant to fight. He began to help her. A word here, a hint there, dropped and then withdrawn before it could be called help. He told her, without ever quite saying it outright, which of the servants Quint spoke to privately when he came down for his Christmas visits, and which rooms Quint kept his papers in, and how it had been Quint, 2 years past, who had recommended the very dealer who bought the great Strathearn pictures, and at what suspiciously low prices they had gone, far below their worth, with Quint himself handling every shilling of the transaction. He brought her, one night, an old account book salvaged from a damp cupboard, the household book from the late Duke's day, and laid it before her without a single word, and bowed and withdrew. "You are very good to me, Hobbs," she said to him once, when she found him alone polishing silver that no longer had any guest grand enough to impress, only out of long habit and love. The old man's hands went still. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice shook, and he did not look up from the spoon in his hands. "I have served this family the whole of my life. My father served it, and his before him. I watched it begin to die these last years, and I did not know how to stop it, and I thought I should have to stand here in this hall and watch it die to the very end, with my own 2 hands carrying out the last of it to be sold." He set the spoon down, carefully, and at last he looked at her, and his old eyes were wet. "You are the first soul who has come into this house in 20 years and looked at the dying of it as though it were a thing that need not happen, as though it might yet be stopped. I should be a very poor servant indeed, Your Grace, and a poorer man, if I did not give you everything I have to help you stop it." Josephine took his old hand in both of hers, there in the cold hall, Duchess and butler, and neither of them said anything more because there was nothing more that needed saying. It was Hobbs, too, who set Polly to watching, though he never knew that was what he had done. Polly was Josephine's own maid, a quick, sharp London girl who had come down with her from her father's house, and Polly had eyes in the back of her head and a way of being entirely invisible that servants who wish to keep their places learn early or not at all. Hobbs, taking the foreign maid under his wing in the warren of the servants' hall, had grumbled to her one evening about the comings and goings of Mr. Quint's man, for Quint, it seemed, did not write all his own letters, not the particular ones, and Polly, who missed nothing, and who had been told by her mistress to miss nothing, had carried it straight upstairs. "Mr. Quint," said Polly, slipping into Josephine's room one cold black morning with her thin face alight, "begging your pardon, Your Grace, but you said to keep my eyes open. He don't write his own letters, not the particular ones. There's a man comes, not a guest, lodges down at the village inn, calls himself a clerk. Quint meets him at the old ice house by the lake, mornings, before the gentry's up and about. I followed, 2 days running. They pass papers, hand to hand, and the clerk, Your Grace." Polly leaned in, her voice dropping. "He ain't no clerk. His hands is too soft and his boots is too good, and he don't carry himself like a man as works for his bread. And the girl at the inn told me, for I stood her a gin and got friendly, that he'd been asking. Asking was the Carver money come into the house yet, and was it true the new Duchess was poking about in the accounts? Josephine went very still. "The Carver money," she said. "He named my father's name." "By name, Your Grace. Carver. Plain as plain. And your father, beg pardon, he asked about him too, this clerk that ain't a clerk, whether the old merchant was as broke as they said. Laughed when he said it. A cold dread settled in the pit of Josephine's stomach and lay there like a stone. It was one thing for Quint to be bleeding the dukedom. That was theft, and theft was wicked, but theft was a thing she understood, a thing with edges and a shape, a thing her whole world had taught her to recognize and reckon with. But for Quint's man to be asking after the Carver money, after her father, by name, before the dowry had even fully cleared into the Strathearn accounts, that was something else entirely. That reached out of the cold ledgers of this strange house, and put its hand on her own family, on her father, and she did not yet see how, but she felt the cold of it the way one feels a draught from a door one had been certain was shut and bolted. She thought of her father at the wedding breakfast, grey-faced, hiding something. Be safe. You'll be safe now. She wrote to him that very day. It was a careful letter, full of nothing on its surface, asking after his health and his ventures, and whether the hard winter found him well and warm. But she folded one question into the middle of it, where a careless reader skimming for matters of interest would slide straight past it. Was the recent trouble with his credit, the sudden debt that had pressed him so very hard last autumn, fully behind him now, and had he ever discovered in the end who it was that had first called in the notes against him and so nearly broken him? She did not yet know what she suspected. She could not have put it into words, but she knew this much. Her father had been pressed by a sudden, ruinous, inexplicable debt the autumn before. She knew it had frightened him, as she had never seen him frightened. She knew it was a great part of why the offer of a ducal marriage for his daughter had seemed to him a salvation he dared not, for her sake, refuse. She had thought it ill luck, bad weather, the kind of squall that strikes any merchant who sails long enough. She was beginning now to wonder whether the squall had had a name. She sealed the letter and gave it to Polly to send by a private route, by the carrier from the next village over that did not pass through the house's ordinary post, which Quint, she did not doubt, could read at his leisure whenever he chose. And then she went back to the books, and she dug, and the deeper she dug, the worse it became. The pattern she had smelled took its shape under her hands over the next many nights, slowly, the way a drowned thing rises by degrees to the surface of a still pond. The Strathearn fortune had not been spent. That was the thing. That was the whole of it. She had assumed, as the Duke had assumed, as anyone would assume, that the money had been lost to the ordinary slow bleeding of a great estate run carelessly. Too many servants, too lavish a style, bad harvests, foolish investments. But it was not so. The money had not been spent. It had been moved. Sums that the fine, false books recorded in their lovely clerkly hand as ordinary expenditure, repairs to distant properties, improvements to far-off farms, investments in this venture and that, corresponded to nothing real in the world. She checked. She wrote through Polly's private carrier to ask. The repairs had not been made. The tenants of those distant properties knew nothing of them. The improvements did not exist. The investments could not be found. The money had gone out of the estate and into a kind of fog, and every time she traced a thread of it through the fog she found, at the far end, the same small clutch of recurring names. Agents, trusts, a company here, a partnership there, and she became slowly, coldly certain that they were all of them the same single hand, wearing a different glove each time, and every glove, if she followed it patiently enough, led home to the same place, to Ambrose Quint. He had not stolen the fortune all at once. That was the genius of it, and the patience of it, and the horror of it. He had bled it, a careful cupful at a time, for 10 years, so slowly and so cleverly that even a watchful master would never have caught it. And the late Duke had not been a watchful master, and the present Duke had inherited a ruin already half accomplished. Together with a man of business he had been taught from the cradle to trust as he trusted the sunrise. Quint had bled the dukedom nearly to death, and the great note that now hung over the whole estate, the one that came due at 12th night, the one that would take everything, Quint held it, through one of his fogs behind one of his gloves, by way of a trust whose true owner was buried under 3 other trusts. But it was his. He had bled the patient white over 10 patient years, and then he had quietly bought up the right to foreclose upon the corpse. She understood the theft now. She could see the whole machine of it. What she did not yet understand was the marriage. Why arrange for the Duke to marry at all? It made no sense. If Quint held the note and the estate could not meet it, he had only to wait for Twelfth Night and call it, and take the lot. Why bring her into it? Why bring her father, and her father's £40,000? Why add a fortune to a thing he intended to seize for nothing? It was the one piece that would not fit, however she turned it, and it nagged at her like a dropped stitch in a row, the small wrongness that tells the knitter the whole pattern has gone astray somewhere far behind. That piece would not come, so she set it aside, the way her father had taught her to set aside a problem that would not yield, never abandoning it, only laying it down where the back of the mind could go on worrying it in the dark, and she carried the rest to the Duke. She did it carefully, on a night when the rest of the house had gone up, and the counting room was theirs alone, and she laid the bones of it before him, the moved money, the fog, the recurring gloves, the great note, and at the heart of all of it the same patient hand, the hand of Ambrose Quint. He did not believe her. She had expected that. She had braced for it all afternoon, and still it was hard to watch. A man does not surrender 30 years of trust on the strength of one woman's reading of a ledger, however clever the woman, however clear the ledger. He went very still, and then very cold, colder than he had been since their wedding night. The warmth she had spent 2 weeks coaxing out of him slamming shut like a window in a gale. "You are speaking," he said, and his voice was the flat, dangerous quiet she had not heard since the cathedral, of a man who stood at my father's deathbed, who held my father's hand while he died, who taught me to ride, who wept. I saw him weep, madam. I was 9 years old, and I saw it at my mother's funeral. He rose from his chair. He has been the one fixed point in my life, the one man I never had to weigh, never had to price, because his loyalty was beyond question. And you are sitting in my house that he has kept standing, and telling me he is a thief. "I am telling you what is in your own books," said Josephine steadily. "Books can be misread, especially by someone newly come to them, eager to prove her worth. It was unfair, and it was cruel, and she saw, even as he said it, that he knew it was both, and that he had said it anyway, because the alternative was to believe her, and the alternative was unendurable. She did not flinch. She had been called worse by better. "Then do not take my reading," she said quietly. "Take your own." And she did not argue with him, because she knew at last, and beyond all doubt, that he did not yield to argument. She did the only thing that had ever worked. She demonstrated. She laid the fine books beside the true books, beside the old salvaged household book of his father's day, 3 sets of figures across the cold table in the candlelight, and she did not tell him a single conclusion. She made him do the arithmetic himself. She walked him through it line by line, sum by sum, entry by entry, hour by hour through the long freezing night, because she had learned that he would not believe a total she handed him, but he could not, being the man he was, disbelieve a total he reached with his own pen, in his own hand, by his own reasoning, and she watched it break him. That was the hardest thing she had yet done in that cold house, harder than the cathedral, harder than the wedding night, to sit beside a proud man at 2 o'clock in the morning and watch, by guttering candlelight, the slow ruin of the one trust he had never once questioned in his whole guarded life. His face did not crumple. It was not a face that knew how, but something went out of it as the night wore on, and the columns came together under his own hand into a total he could not unsee. Some last warmth she had not even known was still in there until she watched it leave, and at the end of it he set down his pen with a hand that was not entirely steady, and stared at the figures in silence for a very long time. 30 years, he said at last. Just that. 2 words, the way she had said 2 words to him on their wedding night. "I am sorry," said Josephine, and she found that she meant it, fully, with a depth that surprised her. "I would have spared you it if there had been any way to save the house without your knowing. There was not. Do not be sorry." His voice was rough, scraped raw. He did not look up from the books. "Do you understand what you have done? Everyone, Josephine, the whole of my life, has lied to me kindly. My father, with his fond words about consequence. My friends who flatter me. Quint, above all of them, with his 30 years of soft, loyal lies. You are the only soul who has ever sat across from me and told me the truth when the truth was hideous, and watched my face while you did it, and not looked away." He raised his head at last, and his grey eyes in the candlelight were terrible and naked, stripped of every defence. "It is the cruelest thing anyone has ever done to me, and it is the most generous, and I cannot tell the two of them apart, and I do not think any longer that they were ever truly separate things at all." Josephine did not trust herself to answer that, so she reached across the cold table, across the ruined ledgers, and she put her hand over his, where it lay flat and still on the false fine books that had betrayed him, and she left it there, and he turned his hand over beneath hers slowly and held it, and neither of them spoke, and the candle burned down, and that was the moment she would know it ever after. That was the moment the pact became something else. The reply from her father came 3 days before Christmas, and it confirmed her worst fear and tore open the door to a far worse one. Josiah Carver wrote plainly, as he did everything in his life. He told her because she had asked, and because he had never in all her years been able to refuse her the truth of a thing, what he had been hiding behind his eyes at the wedding breakfast. The debt that had pressed him last autumn had been real and sudden and ruinous, and it had very nearly broken him entirely. Notes he had not even known existed had been called all at once, every one of them on the same week, by a creditor he could not trace through any of his usual channels. He had been days from disaster, days from losing the fleet, the warehouses, the whole of the thing he had spent his life building. He had not been able to understand it. His credit had been sound, his ventures prosperous. There had been no reason for it. It had fallen on him out of a clear sky like a thunderbolt. And then, exactly as the water closed over his head, exactly when he was drowning, the great offer had come. The offer of a ducal marriage for his daughter, with the promise that the noble connection would steady his shaken credit at a stroke, and the further relief that once the dowry was paid over, the arrangement of it would clear the worst of his own ruinous difficulties through the good offices of his new son-in-law's man of business, who would handle every detail himself, as a kindness, as a courtesy between families now joined. His new son-in-law's man of business, Ambrose Quint. It had been Quint, her father wrote, and Josephine's hands began to shake as she read it. It had been Quint who had brought the whole matter to him in the first place. Quint who had come to him quietly, in his hour of desperation, and proposed the match, and the terms, and the rescue, and had handled the whole of it with such patient kindness and such evident competence that Josiah had wept with relief in front of the man, and thought him very nearly a saint sent by Providence in his darkest hour. Josephine read the letter twice, and then she sat very still, with it in her lap, in the grey light of the cold morning window, while the last piece of the puzzle that had nagged her for a fortnight, the piece that would not fit, the dropped stitch, the marriage that made no sense, turned, and at last, horribly, with a soft click she felt in her chest like a bone going back into its socket, fell into place. He had ruined her father on purpose. Quint had not merely bled the dukedom. He had reached out the autumn before across the whole breadth of England into a family that had nothing to do with Strathearn, and he had manufactured her father's ruin too. He had called in notes, engineered a sudden phantom debt, driven a sound and prosperous and honest merchant to the very edge of the cliff, and then, with the man drowning and gasping and ready to grasp at anything, Quint had appeared, calm and kind and saintly as the very agent of rescue, and he had arranged the marriage. He had drowned a duke slowly over 10 patient years. He had drowned a merchant suddenly, over one cruel season, and then he had brought the 2 drowning men together into the exact marriage, the precise and only marriage that would route £40,000 of fresh Carver money straight through the Strathearn accounts and into the very notes that Quint himself held, so that when he sprang his trap at last, at Twelfth Night, he would take not merely the dukedom but the dowry with it, and would have arranged everything on paper so that the Carver fortune vanished into the same fog as all the rest, leaving 2 ruined families and 1 man walking away from the wreck, the loyal grieving servant of a fallen house, richer by a fortune and a half, a drowning duke and a desperate merchant, made into a biddable pair, made into a convenient marriage. She had not been chosen for her father's money in spite of being trade. She had been chosen because of it. Quint had needed fresh money to flow visibly through the accounts, to disguise the last and largest theft, and he had needed a marriage to make it flow, and so he had reached into her family and broken it, broken her father, broken her own life, deliberately, with planning and patience and care, in order to manufacture the bride he required. She was not a person to Ambrose Quint. She never had been. She was a sum he had needed to move, and he had broken her father's heart to put her where he needed her, the way a man might break a lock to get at what is behind a door. The letter slipped from her fingers to the floor, and Josephine Carver, who had not wept in the cold cathedral, who had not wept on her wedding night, who had not let one of the laughing wolves of the house party see her so much as flinch, Josephine put her face into her two hands and wept then, alone in the grey cold room, with a grief and a rage so tangled together that she could not have separated them with a knife. She wept for her father, for his grey face at the breakfast, for the wedding day weeping she had thought was sentiment and now understood was terror, for he had handed her to a stranger in a cathedral, believing it was the only way to keep her safe, never knowing that the very man who had promised him her safety was the man who had broken him to make the marriage, that the rescue had been the trap, that his saint had been his executioner all along. She wept that her whole life, the dowry saved against her future, the marriage arranged for her good, the safety her father had bought for her with the last of everything he had, that the whole of it had been a board on which she was a single piece, moved by a hand that had never once thought of her as anything but a sum that needed shifting from one column to another. She wept until it had wrung itself out of her, and then she stopped, because weeping, however earned, was not what the moment finally called for, and her father had taught her that too, kneeling beside him at her mother's grave, his hand on her small shoulder. You may weep, Jo, as long and as hard as you need to, and then you will get up and wash your face and go on, because the people you love are still depending on you, and the dead are past your help, but the living are not. She rose. She crossed to the basin and washed her face in the cold water until the redness had gone. She picked the letter up from the floor and folded it, and put it away against her heart. And she went to find her husband, because the time for moving carefully was over, and the time for moving had come. She found Cassian in the long gallery, where the pale squares of the vanished paintings showed even by the thin daylight, ghosts of his family ranged along the cold wall. He turned when she came in, and he saw her face, and whatever he had been about to say went out of him. "What has happened?" he said. She told him. She told him all of it plainly, standing in the cold gallery beneath the empty squares, and she watched his face go from confusion to comprehension to a cold and dangerous stillness that she had never seen in him before, and that she understood watching it settle over him, she would not for the whole world have wanted turned against herself. When she had finished, he was silent for a long time. "He broke your father," Cassian said at last, very quietly, "to make you. He reached across England and ruined a good and honest man, deliberately, in order to manufacture a wife for me, so that he could steal her dowry along with my name and my house and call it all one tidy ruin." He turned to the cold window and the white snow beyond it. "I have spent my whole life believing the worst of people, madam, and pricing them all accordingly, and congratulating myself on my hard, clear sight. And I find that even I, even at my most cynical, did not price Ambrose Quint low enough. There is a kind of evil in this that I did not know how to imagine. He did not merely take, he arranged our grief. He sat at my father's deathbed and held his hand, and somewhere in him, even then, he was already counting. He is very good at it," said Josephine. Her voice was steady now. The weeping was done. What was left underneath it was hard and clear and cold as the lake ice. 30 years of practice. But he has made a mistake, Cassian. The same mistake you made in the cathedral when you looked at me like a column of figures. He thinks he has bought a biddable merchant's daughter, a piece to be moved about his board and then swept off it. He has no notion, none at all, that he has brought into the very heart of his own scheme the one person in England who knows precisely how to take a swindler apart, board and box and all. She crossed to him at the window. She made him look at her. "He has handed me everything," she said. "The books, the names, the gloves, the fog, the whole machine of it. He thinks I am poking about helplessly in accounts I am too simple to understand. He does not know I understand them better than he does himself. We are not going to sit in this house and wait for his trap to close on us at 12th night. Your Grace, we are going to build a better one, and we are going to spring it first, and we are going to spring it in front of every soul in this county." Cassian looked down at her for a long moment, and then something happened to his cold, proud face that she had never seen happen to it before. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. She did not think he had smiled in years, and the muscles had perhaps forgotten how, but it was the foundation that a smile might one day be built upon, the first stone of it laid in the cold light. "Tell me what you need," he said. And here, the men who tell stories like to say, the heroine set her clever plan in motion, and it unfolded smooth as silk. But it was not smooth, and it was not silk, and Josephine would have laughed bitterly at anyone who said so. What she needed was a coalition, and a coalition is not conjured. It is built, the way her father had built his fleet, thread by thread and shilling by shilling, out of trust and risk and a great deal of work, and at every step of the way there was a chance it would all come apart in her hands. What she needed, beneath everything else, was to take away Quint's power, and Quint's power rested entirely on one thing: the notes. His whole scheme stood or fell on the debts that hung against the estate. The great note due at Twelfth Night was Quint's own, held behind his gloves and fogs, his weapon, the one piece of paper he would sooner burn than let go of. But scattered behind it was a cloud of smaller notes and mortgages, run up over the long years of the estate's slow strangling, and these were held by honest third parties, country banks, town merchants, men who had lent in good faith and now believed, as the whole world believed, that Strathearn was dying and their paper near worthless. That cloud of lesser debt was the other half of Quint's lever, for any one of those notes left unpaid would give him the right to call his great note early and foreclose. Josephine saw the way through it the way her father read a hostile cargo manifest, all at once and entire. They could not buy Quint's great note, he would never sell it, but they did not need to. They could buy up every lesser note behind it, quietly, out from under him, clearing away every other creditor and every excuse to foreclose, and they could raise, between them, enough hard money to meet the great note itself, in full, on the very night it fell due. And a creditor whose note is paid to the last farthing holds nothing at all. Let Quint stand up at Twelfth Night and call his debt before the whole company. He would be paid where he stood, and his weapon would turn to dead paper in his hand. The leverage would be gone. The jaws of the trap would close on empty air. It was an enormous undertaking. She had a bare fortnight. She was snowbound, in a hostile house, surrounded by people who would carry any whisper straight to Quint, and she did not have the money. That was the thing that nearly stopped her before she had begun. The notes were worth a great deal. Buying them, even at a discount, would take a sum she did not have because her own dowry was already gone, routed away into Quint's fogs. She sat for the better part of a night with that wall in front of her, and could not see over it. It was Cassian, in the end, who gave her the first foothold, and the giving of it cost him more than she had any right to ask. "There is the London house," he said. "What is left of it? And there are my mother's jewels, the ones Quint has not yet found a reason to sell. They are entailed to no one. They are mine to do with as I please." He said it flatly, but she saw what it cost. Sell them. Pledge them. Whatever a banker can be made to lend against them. It will not be the whole of what you need, but it will be a beginning, and a beginning is what you said you knew how to make. Cassian, your mother's jewels. "My mother," he said, "would think very poorly of me if I kept her diamonds in a box while her house and her son and her daughter went down to a thief. Sell them." And then, after a moment, more quietly, "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for fools either. So she had a foothold. It was not enough. For the rest of it, she would have to do the thing her father had built his whole life upon, the thing the wolves of the house party would never in 1,000 years have understood. She would have to ask other people to risk their money on her word, and she would have to make it worth their while. So she sent, first, for Ezra Tillman. Tillman was a country banker from the nearest market town, a blunt, square, plain-dealing man with no patience whatever for fine manners, and a deep, dry, lifelong suspicion of everyone grander than himself, which was very nearly everyone. Josephine had marked him within her first week in the neighbourhood as the one man of business for 20 miles who was honest, capable, and entirely outside Quint's web of influence. Quint, it turned out, had passed him over for the dukedom's business years before, with a remark about a countryman not being grand enough for Strathearn, and Tillman had not forgotten it. She brought him to the house under cover of a story about reviewing the home farm leases, and she took him into the cold counting room, and she laid the whole of it before him without ornament, banker to merchant's daughter, and she watched his blunt red face go through suspicion and disbelief, and at last a slow, grim, delighted comprehension. "You're telling me," said Tillman when she had done, "that the great Mr. Quint, that the whole county touches its cap to, that I've sat in church behind these 15 years and thought a model of Christian rectitude, has been robbing this dukedom blind for 10 years, and now means to swallow the whole of it down at 12th night, and you mean to buy the notes out from under him before he can shut his jaws." "That is precisely what I am telling you," said Josephine. "And where," said Tillman, leaning back and folding his thick arms, "does a snowbound duchess get the kind of money it takes to buy up the paper on a whole dukedom in a bare fortnight, when the dukedom hasn't a shilling to its name and your own dowry's already vanished into this Quint's pocket? Begging your pardon, your grace, but I've not stayed solvent 30 years by lending against fairy gold." "I do not have the money," said Josephine. Tillman's eyebrows went up. "I have a beginning of it," she went on. "The Duke's mother's jewels and the London house pledged. It is perhaps a fifth of what is needed. The rest I do not have, and so I'm not going to lend it. I am going to borrow it, the same as you would, from the men who trust my father, and I am going to make them glad they lent it." She leaned forward across the cold table. "Hear me out as a banker, Mr. Tillman, and not as a man being asked a favour, because it is not a favour. The lesser notes against this estate are held by honest men who believe Strathearn is dying, and so their paper goes cheap on the quiet market, all but worthless. But Strathearn is not dying. Strathearn is being murdered, by one man patiently, for his own profit. There is a difference, and it is the whole of my case. Cut out the murderer, and the estate is sound, better than sound. I have been near a fortnight in its books, and I will stake my father's name on it. So, a sound estate, its paper bought at a dying estate's price, by men who will hold honest notes against a great house freed of its parasite, repaid out of an income that will at last be allowed to stay where it belongs, with the lasting gratitude of a duke attached to every shilling of it." She let that sit. "That is not charity, Mr. Tillman," she said. "That is the best bargain any man of business in this county will be offered this decade, and you know it, because I have watched you do the arithmetic in your head while I spoke. My father will vouch for me and put up the first of the capital. You will manage the buying, quietly, through your own bank, through a dozen small accounts and a scatter of country names, so that what Quint sees on the market is an ordinary trickle of ordinary investors, and never one hand behind it. And by 12th night, every lesser note will be ours, and the hard money to meet his great one in full will be in our hands, and when he calls his debt, he will be paid to the farthing, and find himself holding nothing at all." Tillman looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he laughed, a short surprised bark of a laugh, and slapped the table with his broad hand. "By God," he said, "begging your pardon, your grace, but I have sat across this very kind of table from a great many men who fancied themselves sharp, peers and bankers and London sharks, the lot of them, and not one in 30 years has laid out a thing as clean as that. Trade, are you?" He shook his head. "Aye, I'll take your bargain, and I'll tell you true, I'll enjoy the taking of it more than any deal I've struck in my life. I've waited 15 years to be grand enough for Strathearn's business. I never thought I'd get grand enough by ruining the man who told me I wasn't. So the coalition was begun, but it was not finished, and it did not run smooth, and there were nights in the next fortnight when Josephine lay awake certain it would all come down. Her father, from town, threw his whole network behind it the moment her second letter reached him, and he understood, truly understood, what had been done to him. She had braced for him to be broken by it, to be shamed, and instead the old fighter in him woke roaring. The merchant houses and shipping men who had trusted Josiah Carver for 30 years, who knew his word was iron, would on that word put up capital to buy a scatter of Strathearn notes. The more gladly when they learned the discount was being created by a thief they would dearly love to see ruined, for Quint, in his cleverness, had cheated a few of them too over the years, in his other dealings, without their ever knowing the whole. Her father became, from 200 miles away, the engine of the thing, but there were setbacks, and they were real, and they frightened her. One of the largest creditors balked, an old cautious banking house in town that held 3 of the heaviest notes and would not sell them to a scatter of country names it did not know, scenting, with a creditor's instinct, that something was afoot. For 4 days that house refused, and 4 of the precious days bled away, and Josephine could do nothing snowbound at Strathearn but write letters and wait and feel the deadline tightening. In the end, it was her father who broke the deadlock, and he broke it the hard way. He went to the old banker in person, laid his own name and his own remaining fortune on the table as security, and pledged that if Strathearn did not come good, he, Josiah Carver, would make every note whole out of his own pocket, or be ruined a second time trying. He staked everything he had left, a second time, for her. The banker, who had known Josiah 30 years and never once seen him stake what he could not afford, sold the notes. When word of it reached her, Josephine wept again, briefly in the cold counting room, and then washed her face and went back to work. And there was the nearer danger, the constant one, that Quint would notice. He was watchful. He read the market the way she read it. A scatter of small purchases was safe, but the buying was not all small, and twice Tillman sent word through Polly's private carrier that a purchase had drawn a question, that someone had been asking in town who exactly was buying up Strathearn paper. Both times it was Hobbs and Polly between them who turned the danger, for Polly had got friendly, over more than one gin, with the maid at the village inn, and through her kept an ear on Quint's soft-handed clerk, and twice Polly brought word in time of what questions Quint was asking, so that Tillman could slow the buying, scatter it differently, let the trail go cold before Quint's man could follow it. It was close. It was close more than once. There was a morning, 4 days before 12th night, when Polly came up white-faced to say the clerk had been seen at the coaching inn taking the London road, and Josephine was certain, for one black hour, that they were discovered and undone, until Polly learned the man had only gone to fetch fresh papers for Quint's own use, and the hour passed, and she could breathe again. And through the whole of it, day after day, she had to do the thing that no one else could do, the thing that cost her most. She had to keep Quint blind. Day after day she played, to his face, the part he expected of her, the trade wife in over her head. She fretted to him over the great accounts she did not understand. She asked him anxious, foolish questions about matters she had grasped weeks before, and let him pat her hand, and let him reassure her in his soft, tired, kindly voice, and watched, sickened as he believed it, watched the satisfaction grow behind his kind eyes, watched him conclude that the new Duchess was no threat at all, but only one more piece sitting exactly where he had placed her on the board. She loathed every minute of it. She did it perfectly. Her father had taught her that the most valuable thing a trader can own is a face that gives away nothing, and she had inherited his whole, and she wore it now from breakfast to candlelight, smiling at the man who had broken her father, while behind the smile she dismantled him piece by piece. Quint, for his part, watched her too, and she felt it, and the two of them went on through the freezing days of that house party, smiling and bowing and circling one another like two duelists who have not yet drawn, each pretending to be deceived, neither deceived in the least, both of them waiting for 12th night. And through all of it, through the fear and the figures and the long deceiving days, the thing between her and Cassian went on quietly thawing, until one night near Christmas it stopped being a thing without a name. It happened, as such things do, over something small. Adela had been singing in the music room after dinner. The whole cold company gathered, her clear young voice filling the candlelit room, her face shining with the pure pleasure of it. And Lady Vesper Holt, who could not bear for any light to shine in any room that was not her own, had made a remark. Soft, smiling, deadly. She had said how charming it was that the dear child still had all her illusions about her come out, given the family's circumstances, and one did so hope nothing would happen to disappoint her. It was aimed to wound, and it found its mark. Adela faltered. The clear voice broke off. She flushed and then went pale, and her bright open face crumpled, because she did not understand the remark, but she understood the cruelty inside it perfectly, the way a child understands a slap before it understands the reason for one. And Josephine, before she had decided to do anything at all, was on her feet. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She crossed the room to the pianoforte and put her hand on Adela's shoulder, and she spoke into the listening silence, pleasantly, clearly, so that every soul in the room could hear. "I have rarely heard a young lady sing so beautifully," she said, "and I look forward more than I can easily say to standing up beside Lady Adela at her come-out in the spring, which will be, I have not the smallest doubt, the most talked-of debut of the entire season." She said it with the absolute, settled, unshakable certainty of a woman stating a plain fact about a thing already arranged, and she looked, while she said it, directly at Lady Vesper Holt, and held her eyes, and there was something in the look, something her father wore when a man tried to cheat him, and did not yet know that he had been found out, that made even that bright cold blade of a woman lower her gaze and find something interesting to study in her own lap. It was nothing. It was a small thing said in a music room. The party turned back to its cards and its talk and forgot it within the hour. But Cassian did not forget it. Across the room he had watched his wife rise without hesitation to defend his sister against a cruelty he had not himself been quick enough to catch. He had watched her promise the girl, in front of all of society, a future that the two of them, and no one else in that room knew, hung by a single thread that Josephine herself was, at that very hour, half killing herself to hold. He had watched her stake her own certainty, her own face, to give a frightened child something to hold on to. And something in his guarded heart came open that had been shut, he thought, for the whole of his adult life, shut so long he had forgotten it was a door at all and not a wall. He found her afterward, in the cold gallery where she had gone to be alone, among the pale squares of the missing paintings. "You promised her a season we may not be able to give her," he said. "We will be able to give it to her," said Josephine. "I have decided, and I have generally found that the things I decide upon tend, in the end, to happen, given enough work and enough nerve." He came and stood beside her, looking up at one of the pale, empty squares on the wall, the brighter rectangle of unfaded paper where something had once hung. "That was my mother," he said, unexpectedly, into the quiet. "The portrait that hung there. Quint sold it 18 months ago. He came to me very grave and said the household needed money against a difficult quarter, and that the dealer he knew was the finest in London and would give the best price obtainable, and that it grieved him to advise it, but advise it he must." His jaw tightened. "And I let him carry my mother out of this house, in a cart, under a cloth, to be sold for a fraction of her worth so that the difference could go into his own pocket. And I shook his hand afterward and thanked him for his good management of a painful business." He was silent a moment. "I have been such a fool, Josephine, a proud, cold, careful fool who believed himself far too clever to ever be deceived, and was deceived more deeply, and for longer, and more completely than any man in England." "You were not a fool," said Josephine. "I let him sell my mother." "You were betrayed," she said, "by a man who had spent 30 years earning the right to betray you, who began earning it before you were born. That is not the same thing as folly, Cassian, and you must stop telling yourself that it is, because it is not true, and it is doing you harm. A fool is undone by his own foolishness. You were undone by another man's patience. There is no shame in being robbed by the most patient thief in England. The shame is all his, every grain of it, and I will not stand here and watch you take it onto yourself to spare him, because he has had quite enough from this family that did not belong to him." He turned and looked at her. The gallery was cold and dark and lit by a single branch of candles she had carried in, and the ghosts of his family hung in their pale empty squares all down the wall, and he looked at her for a long time, longer than he had ever looked at her, and when he spoke his voice was low and not entirely steady. "I do not understand you," he said. "I have turned it over and over, and I cannot make it come out. I lied to you, and used you, and spent your fortune before you ever set eyes on my house. I brought you into a nest of vipers and a sinking ruin and a marriage no sane woman would have wished for, and you have answered every blow of it with kindness and competence, and a quality I can only call loyalty, to a man and a house and a sister that have done nothing on this earth to earn it from you." His hand, she saw, was not quite steady at his side. "I have spent my whole life pricing the worth of everything and everyone alive, and I cannot price you. I have tried, and the sum will not come right, and I have begun to suspect it never will, because you are not a quantity, Josephine. You are something else, something I have no arithmetic for. And I find—" He stopped. He drew a breath. "I find that I do not want you to stop. That is the whole of it. I have wanted a great many things in my life that I could name and price and reach for, and now I want one thing that I cannot do any of those two, and it is you, and it terrifies me, because I do not know how to want a thing I cannot count, and I have never in my life been so afraid of losing anything as I am, suddenly, of losing you." Josephine's own breath had gone shallow. "Then do not lose me," she said. "It is not so very difficult. I'm not going anywhere. I married you, Cassian, and I find, to my own very great surprise, and rather against my better judgment, that I should like to stay married to you for reasons that have nothing whatever to do with £40,000, and that I could not put a price on either, though I have tried, because I distrust anything I cannot account for, and I have been trying to account for you for a fortnight, and I cannot do it." He did not kiss her then. That was not yet his way, and Josephine, watching him war with himself, with 35 years of held-shut doors, would not have hurried him for the world. But he reached out, there in the cold gallery beneath the empty square where his mother had hung, and he took her hand, and he held it, and the two of them stood together in the candlelight for a long while without speaking, and it was, she thought, a truer wedding than the cold cathedral had ever been. The thaw had become a fire. Neither of them said so yet, but they both knew it, and the knowing changed the work, and the work went on, and the days ran down toward Twelfth Night. Christmas came and went, a strange, tense, beautiful feast in the hollowed house, the wolves laughing over the goose and the wine, Adela bright and happy, the trap tightening in silence under all of it. The new year turned, and then the days began to run very fast indeed, the way the tide comes in over flat sand, slow, and then all at once faster than a person can walk. 2 days before the deadline, the trap was very nearly complete. Tillman sent word, through Polly's careful private carrier, that the work was all but done. Every lesser note scattered behind the great one had been quietly purchased, a few at a time, over a hard fortnight, by the scatter of carver men and country investors he had assembled, and they sat now in a strong box in his bank in the market town, owned to the last scrap by friends of the new Duchess, with only the formal transfer left to complete on the very morning of Twelfth Night, and beside the notes raised between the mother's jewels and the London house, and the pledges of her father's network, stood the hard money to meet Quint's own great note in full the instant he dared to call it. Quint, watching the market with his careful eyes, had seen nothing in it but an ordinary trickle of small paper changing hands among small men who could not possibly threaten a thing. He still believed he held the dukedom in his fist. He was about to learn otherwise, but he moved first, not against Josephine, whom he still discounted entirely, but against Cassian, whom he meant to break, and the breaking of him was very nearly done in the cold light of a January morning, 2 days before the end. Quint came to the Duke in the library alone. Cassian had been expecting it. Josephine had told him it would come, that a man like Quint with his trap ready to spring would not simply call the note and shame the family in a cold legal letter, but would come first, in person, in his soft, loyal voice, and offer the Duke a way out, because a way out was the bait that made the trap close cleanly. So Cassian was ready, but knowing a blow is coming, he found, did not make the receiving of it easy, and there was a part of the next hour that he never afterward described to anyone, not even to her, because it shamed him. Quint came in grave and stooped. The very picture of the faithful old servant bowed beneath a painful duty. He laid it all out, sorrowing, in his soft carrying voice. He confessed, and Cassian, listening, thought it a kind of black masterpiece. He confessed that matters were even worse than the Duke knew, that the great note could not, in the end, be met, that the estate was lost, that foreclosure at Twelfth Night was now a certainty, and that the family faced not merely embarrassment, but utter and public ruin. The auction of Strathearn itself, the whole catastrophe paraded before the very society now gathered beneath its roof for Christmas. And then, having painted the abyss in careful strokes, having let the Duke stand at the very lip of it and look down, Quint offered him a rope. There was a way out, Quint said gently. He had, through his own efforts and his own connections, found a party, a discreet and powerful party, willing to take on the whole of the notes and refinance them, to keep the dukedom afloat and the family's ancient name unstained. On one condition: the scandal of the empty coffers had to be explained to the world, and the explanation had to be the merchant. It would be put about, quietly, with documents to support it, documents that Quint could readily arrange, that the ruin of Strathearn had come not from any failing of the noble house, but from the dishonest dealing of the trade family the Duke had so unwisely married into, that Josiah Carver had defrauded his ducal son-in-law, that the dowry had been a sham, the Carver fortune a fiction, the whole marriage a swindle worked upon an innocent and trusting peer by a grasping merchant who had pushed his own daughter into a great house to mask his crookedness and gain a hold on a dukedom. It was, Quint said, with every appearance of regret, the only way. The Carvers would be ruined, yes, but they were trade, and trade was resilient, and they would recover in time, as such people did. The Duke must think of his ancient name, of his innocent young sister, whose entire future hung on it. He need only sign the papers that Quint would prepare, disavow the trade wife's family, set the merchant up to take the public blame, set aside the wife herself, in due and decent course, as a wronged man's reasonable redress, and the dukedom would be saved, the scandal contained, the name preserved spotless. Quint would handle everything, every detail, as he always did, as he had always done, the faithful servant managing the family's painful business with his own discreet hands. What Cassian knew, and what Quint could not know he knew, was that there was no rescuing party. There never had been. The discreet and powerful party willing to take on the notes was Quint himself, behind one more glove, and the rope he offered was the noose itself, oiled and ready. The moment the Duke signed papers blaming the carvers and granting Quint authority to manage the rescue, Quint would hold, in the Duke's own hand and over the Duke's own seal, a written confession that the dukedom was insolvent, the carver's guilt manufactured and signed and sworn, and full authority over the whole of the estate's affairs, and he would foreclose anyway, take the lot, and leave the Duke holding a document that branded him a fool and his wife's father a criminal before all the world, with no recourse and no defence because he would have signed away the truth with his own hand. Cassian knew all of it, and here is the thing he was ashamed of afterward, the part he never told. For one moment, one single moment in the cold library, with the snow falling outside and the man who had taught him to ride looking at him with kind, tired eyes and a pen held out, he was tempted. Not by the trick. He saw the trick. But Quint, the patient reader of men, had aimed his offer with terrible accuracy at the one true weakness left in the Duke of Strathearn, at the man Cassian had been for 35 years, the man who had always, in the end, chosen his name over any living person, who had let his own mother's portrait be carried out under a cloth, rather than show the world a crack in the family's consequence. For one cold moment, the old man surfaced in him, and whispered that the name was the thing, that it had always been the thing, that the merchant was after all a stranger, and the wife a bargain struck in a cathedral, that a duke's first and last duty was to the dukedom and the dead generations who had handed it down, and that a single signature would make the whole nightmare go away, for one moment. And then he thought of a cold counting room, and a cup of tea brought at 2 a.m, and a woman who had told him the truth when the truth was hideous, and had not looked away. He thought of Josephine standing in the music room, staking her own certainty to give his frightened sister a spring. He thought of her face when she had told him what Quint had done to her father, the grief in it, scrubbed clean and held up straight, and the old man inside him, the man who priced everything, went quiet and did not speak again, and Cassian understood in that silence that he was not any longer the man Quint took him for, that somewhere in 3 weeks of cold candlelight he had become someone his own father would not have recognized, and that he was glad of it, fiercely and finally glad. So he did the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than burying his father, harder than learning the truth of the books. He did not strike the man down. He did not throw the offer in his face. He looked into that kind, tired, monstrous face, the face that had lied to him for 30 years, and he said, evenly, that it was a great deal to weigh, that he would need to consider it, that Quint was right, of course, to think first of the name and of Adela, that he would give his answer at the 12th night assembly, when the matter must in any case be settled. He let Quint leave the library believing he had won. He let the man walk out into the snowlight, with the small private satisfaction of a craftsman whose long work is nearly done, believing that the proud cold Duke of Strathearn would do, in the end, exactly what such a man always did, and throw his trade wife and her father to the wolves to save his precious name. It was the disguise the trap required, and it was the most repellent hour of Cassian's life, and he came out of it grey and shaking, and went to find his wife. He told her of it that night in the counting room with 2 days left on the clock. He told her all of it, even after a long silence the party was ashamed of, the moment of temptation. He had not meant to tell her that. He found he could not tell her, because she had told him the truth when it was hideous, and he would not do less for her. For one moment, he said low, not looking at her, I wanted to sign it, not the trick. I saw the trick. I wanted the name back. The old man in me wanted it. The man I've been my whole life, who would always choose Strathearn over a person, and who very nearly did it again, with the pen in front of me and your father's good name the price. He made himself look up at her. I am telling you because you should know what you have married. He did not aim wrong, Josephine. He aimed at exactly the man I was. He only did not know that man is dying, that you have been killing him, slowly, by candlelight, these 3 weeks, and that I have let you, and that I am glad. Josephine was quiet for a moment. She had to ask the next thing. She would not have been honest with him, or with herself, if she had not asked it, and she had built a whole coalition, staked her father's name a second time, on the answer. You are certain, she said, when you stand up at 12th night, before all of them, with your name and your fortune and your sister's future offered back to you for the price of one signature, while the alternative is open ruin in front of every soul who has ever sneered at us both. You are certain which way you will choose, because I have built everything on the certainty of it, Cassian, and I have been made a fool of in front of society once already, in a cold cathedral, and I will not do it twice. So, if there is any doubt left in you, any at all, I would rather know it now, tonight, than at the foot of the assembly. He rose. He came around the cold table. He stood before her and took both her hands in both of his. There is no doubt in me, he said. Hear me, because I will say it plainly, and only once, and plainness does not come easily to me. I have been a man of doubt my whole life. I doubted every person and weighed every choice and trusted nothing on this earth that I could not count and hold. And then I married a woman for her money to buy 4 weeks, and I discovered, too late to be at all sensible about it, that she is the one thing I have ever encountered in my life that I cannot weigh and would not trade for anything the world contains. His grip on her hands tightened. I priced you at £40,000, Josephine. I was a fool, and I undervalued you by everything I own and everything I am. Let Quint offer me my name. Let him offer me England. The answer is you. It will always, from this night forward, be you. There is no doubt in me at all. And then, at last, in the cold counting room, with the false books and the true books spread between them, and 2 days left on the clock, the Duke of Strathearn gathered his wife into his arms and kissed her, and it was not cold, and it was not careful, and it was nothing at all like a transaction. It was the only thing in 3 weeks that neither of them had counted the cost of first. There remained one piece, and it was the hardest of all, and Josephine would not pretend it was easy, or that it came by cleverness alone. For all that the notes were nearly bought, buying them only disarmed Quint. It did not destroy him. A man like Quint, stripped of his leverage, would simply melt back into his disguise, the faithful servant grieved by a misunderstanding, and live to scheme another decade, and walk free. To destroy him, to end him before all the county with no escape, she needed proof of the theft itself, proof in his own hand, and the only such proof that could exist was his own private accounting of it, the true coded ledger of his decade of embezzlement, which Polly's eyes had told them he kept and carried, and which he passed, page by page, hand to hand, to his soft-handed go-between at the old ice house by the lake. Getting it was not clever. It was dangerous, and it was uncertain, and it nearly failed. It was Tillman who found the lever, in the end, and the lever was the go-between himself, the soft-handed clerk who was no clerk, turned out, when Tillman's quiet inquiries in town ran him to ground, to be a man with debts of his own and very little loyalty to anything but his own skin, a hired tool, not a true accomplice, who knew only that he carried a certain leather book between Quint and a strong-box in town, and was paid well for asking no questions about what was written in it. Tillman put it to him plainly, in the back room of the village inn 3 nights before 12th night, with Polly listening at the keyhole, and one of his own stout clerks planted square in the only other door. Your master is going to hang, Tillman said, or near enough to make no difference. The rope is already about his neck. He simply has not yet felt it draw tight. The one question left in the world for you, friend, is whether you are standing beside him when it does, or whether you have turned witness, and walked out of this inn a free man with your skin whole. I should think on it quickly were I you. That book you carry decides which. The man looked from the blunt banker to the door he could not reach, and his nerve went out of him all at once. He was frightened, and he was greedy, and he was not brave. He took the road that saved his own neck. He gave up the book, Quint's own coded ledger, the leather-bound volume Polly had watched cross his hands at the ice house all those frozen mornings, and he gave, with it, his plain word as to what it was, and whose hand had filled it, and where each page had gone. And because the ledger lived, between Quint's quiet visits, locked in that town strong-box in the go-between's own keeping, and because the frightened man was made to send his master one last unremarkable word that all stood exactly as it should, Ambrose Quint went on through his final 2 days serene and unknowing, certain his secret accounting sat safe under lock where he had left it, never once dreaming it lay open on a duchess's table, surrendering its cipher to her line by patient line. But the ledger was in cipher, and a cipher is not cracked by wishing. Josephine did not crack it in an afternoon, and she would have laughed at any story that said she had. She worked at it 3 nights running, until her eyes ached and the candles guttered, and for 2 of those nights she got nowhere, and despaired, and was certain it would defeat her with the deadline at her throat. It was not a brilliant flash that broke it in the end. It was drudgery, and it was the go-between's testimony, and it was the true books beside it, for the man could tell them roughly which thefts the entries recorded, and the true reconstructed books told her the sums and the dates of those same thefts, and with the plain meaning of a dozen entries known from the outside, the cipher began, slowly, grudgingly, to give up its key the way a stuck lock gives at last to patience rather than force. By the 3rd grey morning, she had enough of it. Not all, but enough to read aloud before witnesses, entries that named sums and dates and the very Strathearn accounts they had been stolen from, in Ambrose Quint's own coded hand. It was not magic. It was arithmetic and nerve and a frightened man's testimony and a fortnight of work, and it was very nearly not enough, and it was done by the narrowest margin in the last grey hours before the day. But it was done. 12th night came. The great hall of Strathearn Court had not blazed so bright in 20 years. Whatever else had been sold, the chandeliers remained, and Josephine had ordered every candle in the house lit, all of them, a deliberate and reckless extravagance, and Hobbs, when she gave the order, had understood exactly why, and had lit them himself, with his own old hands, one branch from another, his face wet, because he knew what the blazing was for. She wanted the room blazing for what was to come. She wanted no shadow anywhere in it for a thief to hide in. The whole house party was gathered, and half the county besides, the grand and the gentry come for the famous Strathearn 12th night, all of them in their silks and their jewels under the blazing light, all of them, Josephine knew, moving among them with her unreadable trader's face, expecting one kind of evening, and about to be handed another entirely. Lady Vesper Holt was there, magnificent in gold, watching the new Duchess with bright, spiteful eyes, certain, for Quint had fed her hints all the week, the better to spread them, that something was about to break this night, and certain that it would break over Josephine's head. Adela was there, anxious and lovely, not understanding the tightness in the air but feeling it, keeping close to Josephine's side. Hobbs stood by the great doors, white-haired and upright, his old eyes moving everywhere. Ezra Tillman waited in a cold anteroom off the hall, a strong box at his feet and 2 clerks beside him, for the signal. Josiah Carver had come up from town that very morning through the snow, and stood now at the edge of the crowd, grey and grim, his eyes on his daughter, and somewhere in the brilliant company moved Ambrose Quint, neat, silver, patient, the faithful servant waiting for the proud Duke to do the thing he was so very sure the Duke would do. It came near the height of the evening, exactly as Quint had arranged it, in front of everyone. He had primed the room well, a whisper here, a grave word there, all the week, so that when he stepped forward at last, apparently with the greatest reluctance, the loyal old retainer driven by conscience to a painful duty, the whole brilliant company fell quiet of itself and turned to listen. He had papers in his hand. He spoke, in his soft, tired, carrying voice, of grave matters, of the estate's troubles, of a fraud most foul worked upon a noble house, and the room leaned in, scenting blood, the way such rooms always do, and his kind, tired eyes went as he spoke to Josephine and to her father at the edge of the crowd. He laid it out beautifully. The Duke, he said, sorrowing, had been deceived. The dukedom stood at the very lip of ruin, and the cause of that ruin was not the noble house, but the grasping trade family that had wormed its way in through a marriage. He spoke of the Carver fortune as a fiction, of Josiah Carver as a common swindler, of the dowry as a fraud upon an innocent peer. He produced his documents and held them up to the blazing light, and he turned at the very last to the Duke, who stood pale and still at the head of the hall, and he invited him, gently, as one offers a drowning man a rope, to confirm it before them all, to disavow the tradewife and her crooked father, to save his ancient name, to sign. The hall held its breath. Lady Vesper Holt was smiling. Josephine stood very still beside her husband and did not move and did not speak, because this was his moment, his alone. And she had built the whole of everything on her certainty of what he would do with it. And now, at the last, with the room blazing and silent and the whole county watching, she had to do the hardest thing of all, which was to trust him and wait. Cassian Reeve, the 7th Duke of Strathearn, looked out over the breathless room. He looked at Quint, and at the documents, and at his trembling young sister, and at the grey grim merchant at the edge of the crowd, and last and longest at his wife, and the old man in him was silent. There was no whisper left. There was only the certainty he had promised her in the counting room 2 nights before, settled in him now hard and clean as ice on the lake. And then he spoke, and he pitched his voice to carry the whole length of the great hall, and every word came out clear and ringing and final. "You offered me my name and my fortune back," the Duke said, loud enough for the length of the hall. "If only I would throw my wife and her father to the wolves. Here is my answer, Quint. I would sooner be a pauper wed to Josephine Carver than a duke who kept your silence 1 hour longer." The hall erupted, a confusion of gasps and cries and the sharp hiss of 300 indrawn breaths, and Quint's kind, tired face went, for the first time in 30 years, entirely blank with shock. And into that noise, into that blankness, Josephine stepped forward, because Cassian had thrown the door wide open and now it was hers to walk through. "My husband," she said, and her clear trader's voice cut through the babble and silenced it as a knife silences cloth, "has told you the truth. Now I shall tell you the rest of it, and I have brought documents of my own." And she did, standing in the blazing hall before the whole of the society that had sneered at her in a cold cathedral 1 short month before. The merchant's daughter laid out the entire machine of it, plainly the way her father had taught her to lay a thing before men who needed to be made to understand it, whether they wished to or not. She told them how the Strathearn fortune had not been spent but stolen, bled out a careful cupful at a time, over 10 patient years, by the trusted man of business who stood before them. She told them how that same man had reached across the whole breadth of England the autumn before, and manufactured the ruin of a sound and honest merchant house, calling in notes without warning or cause, breaking her own father deliberately in order to drive him into a desperate marriage. She told them how Quint had arranged the very match himself, a drowning duke and a desperate merchant manoeuvred together into the one marriage that would rout the Carver dowry straight through the Strathearn accounts, and into the very notes Quint himself secretly held, so that he might foreclose at last, and take the dukedom and the dowry together, and walk away the faithful grieving servant of a fallen house, richer by a fortune. The room was utterly silent now. Not one fan moved, and Josephine saw Quint gathering himself, saw him reach even now for the old disguise, for the calm, sorrowful voice that would dismiss her, call her a hysterical tradewife spinning fantastical fictions to save her own family from the just consequences of its crimes. She saw him draw the breath to do it. She did not give him the chance. "He believes," she said, raising her own voice over his indrawn breath, "that the great note against this estate is his weapon, that when he calls it tonight, as he means to, Strathearn cannot pay, and the whole of it falls into his open hand. He has watched the market this fortnight and seen nothing to alarm him." She turned, and she lifted one hand, and Hobbs threw open the great doors at the end of the hall. Ezra Tillman walked in his plain blunt country coat, a strong-box under his arm, and behind him came his 2 clerks bearing ledgers. "Mr. Tillman," said Josephine, "be so good as to tell this company how the debt of Strathearn stands tonight." "I will," said Tillman in his flat, blunt voice, and he set the strong-box down upon a table with a thump that echoed off the high ceiling. "Every lesser note and mortgage that ever stood against this estate, save one, has been bought up quietly, over the past fortnight, off the open market, by a company of honest investors that I have the honour to represent, at the request of Her Grace the Duchess of Strathearn, and on the personal security and pledge of Mr. Josiah Carver of London." He flipped back the lid of the strong-box, and the blazing candlelight fell on a thick, fat sheaf of documents. every scrap of it, held now by friends of this house, and not one of them with any wish on earth to foreclose. There remains only the great note, the one Mr. Quint holds in his own hand, behind his own trusts, the one he means to call tonight to take the dukedom. He bent and lifted a second box from beside his feet and threw open the lid, and gold and banker's paper gleamed in the candlelight. And here is the money to pay it, in full, to the last farthing, the instant he is bold enough to call it. He turned to look at the silver-haired man, and there was nothing soft in his blunt face at all. So, call your note, Mr. Quint. You will be paid where you stand, before this whole company, and a creditor whose debt is paid to the farthing holds nothing at all, no estate, no leverage, no dukedom, no hold on any soul in this room. You never once noticed it slip from your fingers because you were watching a duke you meant to break, and you never thought to watch the trade wife you despised. A sound went through the hall like wind through standing wheat, and Ambrose Quint, at last, broke. The kind, tired mask cracked and fell clean away, and for one terrible moment the whole blazing room saw what had been living underneath it for 30 years. Something cold and clever and venomous, and now, suddenly, naked and very much afraid. He flung out his arm and snarled that it was a lie, a fabrication, the desperate invention of a grasping merchant's brat, that he would see them all in the courts, that no judge and no gentleman in England would take the word of a woman from trade over the loyal servant of the house of Strathearn. "They need not take my word," said Josephine. She nodded, and Polly, quick, sharp, invisible Polly, who had watched the ice house through all those frozen black mornings, who had stood the in-girl gin and listened at doors, came forward through the parting crowd and placed in Tillman's hand a small, worn, leather-bound book, Quint's own ledger, his private coded record of 10 years of patient theft, kept in his own hand, because even a master swindler must keep his accounts somewhere, must know to a shilling what he has stolen and where it lies. Recovered 3 nights past from his own frightened go-between, who stood now, Josephine knew, in Tillman's keeping, ready to swear to what it was, and whose hand had written it. She took the book, she opened it to the place she had marked, and into the dead silence of the great hall she read aloud, slowly, clearly, so that every word carried 3 entries, 3 lines that named sums and dates and the very Strathearn accounts each sum had been stolen out of, in Ambrose Quint's own coded hand, decoded by 3 sleepless nights and a frightened man's testimony, and the patient arithmetic of a merchant's daughter. She read the 3 lines, and she watched Quint's face as she read them. She watched him understand that it was over, that 30 years of patience had come undone in a single blazing evening at the hands of a girl from trade, that there was no kind, tired voice left in all the world that could talk him out of his own ledger, read aloud in his own hand before the whole assembled county. He turned to run. There was nowhere to run. Tillman's stout clerk stood at the doors, and 2 magistrates among the guests, for Quint, in the towering arrogance of his certainty, had himself helped draw up the guest list, and had filled it with the grand and the powerful, the better to witness his triumph, and they would witness his ruin instead, were already moving toward him through the crowd, and the loyal servant of the house of Strathearn was taken, white and shaking, and stripped at last of every disguise he had worn for 30 years, in the middle of the blazing hall, before all of society, with no mercy and no escape, and no rope left to him but the one he had so patiently woven for everyone else. And Lady Vesper Holt, who had spent the whole week whispering Quint's careful poison through the company, in the bright certainty that it would destroy the trade wife she despised, found herself, in that moment, standing in a room that had just watched her be the eager and witless instrument of an exposed and arrested thief. She found every pair of eyes that had lately deferred to her now sliding away from her in cold contempt. She found her malice curdled to ash in her mouth, in front of the very society whose good opinion was the only thing she had ever truly possessed in this world. She left Strathearn before dawn, in the dark, in the cold, and she was within the month a thing the whole of the ton laughed at behind its fans, which for a woman like Lady Vesper was a kind of death, and a fitting one, and she had bought it entirely with her own cruelty. But all of that came after, in the blazing hall, in the moment itself, when Quint had been led out white and broken, and the great uproar had begun to settle into the giddy, astonished, delighted buzz of a society that has just watched something it would be telling its grandchildren about for 40 years. In that moment, the Duke of Strathearn turned to his wife, in front of every soul in the room, and did the last thing that any of them expected, the thing that cold, proud men are never supposed to do. He took her hand, he raised it to his lips, and then he did not let it go, but held it, and turned, and faced the whole bright watching room, and spoke so that all of them could hear. "You have all of you known me a long time," he said, "and you have known me as a cold man, and a proud one, and you were not wrong to. I have spent my whole life pricing the worth of everything and everyone alive, and trusting nothing I could not count and hold in my own 2 hands. It very nearly destroyed me, and this house, and every soul who depends upon it." He looked down at Josephine, and the whole hall saw the proud, cold face of the Duke of Strathearn open like a window thrown wide to the morning. "I married this woman for £40,000. I told her so to her face on our wedding night, in very nearly those words, because I am, whatever else I am, not a liar to the few I love. I married her for her money, and I have discovered these 3 weeks that she is worth more than money, more than this house, more than the ancient name I was so very afraid of losing, that she is, in plain fact, the one thing in all my careful arithmetic that I cannot put a price upon at all, and would not, though I could." He drew her closer, there before them all, and he lowered his voice so that the next words were for her, though the silent, breathless hall hung on every one of them. "I married you for £40,000, he said. "I am keeping you for nothing at all." And Josephine Carver, the Duchess of Strathearn, the trade girl who had been sold a coronet in a cold cathedral, and had instead brought back a whole dukedom and a proud man's locked heart along with it, found that for once in her composed and clear-eyed life she had nothing whatever to say. So she said nothing. She let him kiss her instead, in the blazing hall, before the whole of the society that had sneered at her 1 short month before, and the society, fickle and astonished and helplessly delighted, after a moment of stunned silence, broke into applause. The weeks that followed remade Strathearn from its very foundations, though not in the way the world expected, because the world expected the scandal to be quietly buried, and the Duke of Strathearn did the precise opposite. Ambrose Quint was stripped of everything he had stolen. Every glove and fog and false company of his was unravelled, slowly and thoroughly by Tillman's clerks and Josephine's reading of the coded ledger and the testimony of the frightened go-between, and what could be recovered was recovered, and the rest was made whole by the unwinding of the notes. Quint himself was handed to the law for his 30 years of patient theft, and he was tried, and he was ruined as completely and as publicly as he had meant to ruin the family he had served. He went, in the space of a single season, from the most trusted man in the county to a byword for treachery that mothers used to frighten foolish sons, and no kind, tired, loyal voice ever spoke again for Ambrose Quint, because there had never truly been such a man, only a coat worn so long it had passed for skin. The estate, freed at last of the parasite that had been killing it by the cupful for 10 years, proved sound, more than sound. Josephine had been right about that, as she had been right about very nearly everything. Once the bleeding stopped, once the true books replaced the false ones and an honest hand took up the management, and the income was simply allowed to stay where it belonged, Strathearn began, for the first time in a generation, to live within its means, and then slowly to grow. The notes, held now by friends rather than by an enemy, were refinanced on fair and patient terms, and paid down steadily out of an estate that was suddenly, after so long, permitted to keep what it earned. Josephine's dowry, what could be traced of it through Quint's tangled affairs, was recovered. Her father's manufactured ruin was reversed, his credit restored, his good name cleared before the very men who had begun, the autumn before, to doubt him. But the thing that scandalized the whole of the ton, the thing they talked of behind their fans and over their cards for years afterward, was what the Duke did next. He did not hide his fall. A man of his old pride would have buried the whole affair past finding, would have let the world go on believing that Strathearn had always been sound, and would have died sooner than admit that an ancient dukedom had come within 2 days of going down to a thief, and had been saved, at the last, by a merchant's daughter and her father's shipping money. The man Cassian had been would have done exactly that. He would have counted it the only sane choice. The man he had become did the unthinkable. He wedded the title to the trade, openly, in the full light of day, and dared the world to make of it what it liked. He took his wife's father, Josiah Carver, the self-made shipping merchant the Ton had sneered at, into a true partnership. A real one, on paper, properly drawn, with the dukedom's lands and the merchant's fleet and warehouses joined into a single living working concern, run with Carver's hard commercial sense and Strathern's ancient holdings and Josephine's sharp, clear head presiding over the whole of it. And he let it be known, plainly, to anyone who asked and many who did not, that he was not ashamed of it, that the trade he had once thought so far beneath him had saved him when his own kind would have stood by and watched him drown, that he meant to run his dukedom henceforth as a living concern, and not a gilded ruin held up by lies, and that society might make of all that precisely whatever it pleased. Society was scandalized, society whispered itself hoarse, and then the partnership began to make money, a great deal of money, honest visible money that filled the long empty coffers, and lit the small fires high and warm, and brought back, in time, one by one as they came onto the market, the very paintings that Quint had carried out under his cloths. His mother's portrait hung again in the long gallery before the year was out, in its own pale square made whole, and Cassian stood before it a long time the day it was rehung, and said nothing, and Josephine stood beside him, and let him not say it, and society, which will forgive very nearly anything that turns a profit, swallowed its scandal whole, and came round, and within 2 years an invitation to the famous working estate at Strathern, to see the Duke who had married trade and made it pay, and the Duchess who had outwitted a master swindler in her wedding month, was among the most sought-after cards in the whole of the county. Adela had her season, the most talked-of debut of the spring, exactly as Josephine had promised her in the cold music room with the whole sneering house listening, and she married, in her own time, and entirely for love, a young man with very little fortune to speak of, and a very great deal of kindness in him, and her brother, who had once priced everything that breathed, gave them his blessing, and a generous settlement, and did not once ask what the young man was worth, because he had learned, at long last and at great cost, that it was the wrong question, and had always been the wrong question, and that he had wasted 30 years asking it. Hobbs lived to see the house come back to life. He wept, the old man, openly and without shame, the first time the great hall blazed with candles for a feast the family could honestly afford to give, and Josephine took his arm and held it, and let him weep as long as he needed to, because he had earned it more than anyone alive, and because she had learned, kneeling at a grave long ago, that there is a time for weeping, and that it must not be hurried. And in the spring, when the hard snow had gone at last, and the frozen lake had thawed and run free, and the home farm was being worked again as the family's own, a new sign went up above the door of the estate counting house, the very room where the false books had once been kept, and where the true ones now lived openly, in the light, for any honest soul to read. The new sign above the estate counting house read, Reeve and Carver, a duke's name beside a merchant's, and painted exactly the same size, because the Duchess of Strathern would not have it any other way. Cassian came upon her standing beneath it the day it was hung, in the thin, bright sunlight of the first truly warm morning of the year. He stood beside her, and he looked up at the two names, his and her father's, the same size, the title and the trade openly and permanently wedded for all the county to read, and he was quiet for a while. "My father," he said at last, "would have died of the shame of it." "And what do you feel?" said Josephine. He considered the question seriously, with the gravity he gave now to all her questions, and then he took her hand, the way he had in the cold gallery beneath his mother's empty square, the way he had in the blazing hall before all of society. "Solvent," he said, "and warm, and married, for the first time in my life, to a woman I would not trade for anything that can be counted, nor for a good many things that cannot." He looked down at her, and the cold, proud face that had once weighed her like a creditor in a cathedral was open now, and unguarded, and entirely hers. "I spent my whole life so afraid of losing my name, Josephine, and in the end I very nearly lost it, and the losing of it gave me you, and I find that I have not the smallest regret in all the world. I would do the whole of it over again. I would marry you for £40,000 100 times, if it brought me, each and every time to this exact morning, and this sign, and you standing under it. It would not cost you 40,000 the second time, said Josephine, who could never quite let an arithmetic pass unexamined. I am a great deal more expensive now. My credit has improved considerably. And the Duke of Strathearn, who had not laughed aloud in the living memory of any servant in the house, laughed then, out loud, in the spring sunlight, beneath the joined names, and pulled his trade wife into his arms. And the great estate around them, for the first time in a whole generation, was solvent and honest and alive. And so, for the first time in his life, was he. The love that had begun in those weeks of cold candlelight was only beginning, you understand. It grew that spring and through every season that came after, the way the strongest things grow, slowly, and from underneath, the way the ice on the lake had thawed, until neither of them could any longer remember a time the other had been a stranger, or a bargain, or a sum that would not settle. But that is a longer story than this one, and it belongs to them, and it does not need telling here. Dear listener, if you have stayed with Josephine and her cold, proud Duke through the long, frozen weeks of their hard winter, perhaps you will carry one small thing away with you into your own night. It is this: the world will sometimes try to tell you what you are worth, and it will use the cruelest arithmetic it can find to do it. It will measure you by the money you brought, or the name you lacked, or the room you were not born into, and it will be very sure of its sums, and it will say them out loud where you can hear, in cold cathedrals behind raised fans. But the world's arithmetic is not the true one. It never was. The true worth of a person is the one thing that cannot be counted at all. The loyalty that fights for a sinking house, the courage that tells a hard truth by candlelight and does not look away, the love that gives up a proud name to keep a heart. No ledger has a column for it. No swindler can steal it. And it is the only thing in the end that any of us truly keeps. So if you have ever been counted cheap by someone too proud or too frightened or too hurried to see you clearly, take heart tonight and rest. The cold ones can thaw. The proud ones can learn, given time and given truth. And the quiet, clever, overlooked soul who keeps her courage and does her patient work and refuses to walk away from a thing she might yet save, she is very often the one who, in the end, saves everything, and is cherished at last for exactly the worth that no one else could be troubled to see. Rest now. Let the frost on your own dark window be only weather, and the fire in your own hearth burn warm, and high, and honestly your own. Whatever cold cathedral you have lately had to walk through with all its watching eyes, there is a blazing hall somewhere ahead of you on the road, and a warm hand that will reach for yours across it, and hold it, and not let go. Sleep well, dear friend. The thaw always comes.